What's a deep, dark rabbit hole to research when bored? Story 1, Cryptozoology. It's interesting to say the least, but there are so many things that make you question what is out there in the world that we haven't discovered yet. When I first got into it, I thought cryptids were more like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, but there are hundreds or even thousands of other weird and unusual sightings of creatures many haven't even heard of. Yes, it's so interesting. I do know that the okapi was considered a cryptid before it was formally proven to exist. Story 2, Fire Disasters. And then never feel safe in an indoor crowded space ever again. There's actually a video on YouTube of the Great White Disaster, and it's utterly horrifying how incredibly quickly it happened and seeing the people literally stuck in the doorway unable to get out as they burned to death. As someone who still goes to a lot of shows at small packed music venues exactly like that one and other totally packed bars and clubs, I'm always constantly looking for exits to find the nearest escape path, and it always freaks me out anytime there's any fire in any indoor space, candles, sparklers, pyrotechnics, etc. Story 3, Mass Hysteria. There are different kinds that have affected different cultures in different ways. Multiple times throughout history, groups of people have uncontrollably danced themselves to death. In other parts of the world, men can become stricken with the belief that their penis is receding into their bodies. It was often believed the only way to prevent this from happening overnight was for family members to hold their members, etc. Story 4, Money Laundering and how laundered money flows around the world. Most info is public from gov agencies like the CIA and State Department. How money laundering looks a lot like most tax evasion schemes. From a computer detection standpoint, they're almost the same thing when all you can view is, say, financial transactions and records. How many prominent banks, politicians, and authorities will alert on models built using the information in 1. How little cops and the government fund investigations and detection of such activities. Usually our models were just so some institution could check a box, and the unspoken truth was that the execs at large financial institutions didn't really put a lot of time or effort into our work, even when it was good. Story 5, Post-WOTO industries. Take fertilizer, lawn care, and home gardening, for example. A very specific push to get chemical fertilizers in every home, monoculture lawns that require a lot more input, and a clean lawn has left us where we are now. Very silly that we strayed away from what we had previously. Story 6, Prion diseases. Every single one is weird and dark. It includes cannibalism and family curses, and deers walking on 2 legs, and industrial farming, plus forced cow cannibalism. 2 fun facts I learned in med school about this. The most common human prion disease is Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and 85% of cases occur spontaneously. There is a widespread mutation in the human population that protects against Kuru, a human prion disease spread by cannibalizing brains. This suggests cannibalism was a common practice at some point in human history. Story 7, the town of Skidmore, Missouri in the US. It's sort of a small topic, but it leads in so many different directions. It's most famous for the murder of the town bully. That's a mild name for him. He was horrible, in the middle of the day, on the main street with a bunch of witnesses, but no one has ever been arrested. But there's also the later case of a woman who was murdered and her unborn baby stolen, and even later a teenager who was related to the murdered woman just disappeared and is thought to have been taken by a serial killer. All this in a town of fewer than 200 people. I'm not superstitious, but I also wouldn't move there. There is a documentary on Sundance about the bully, but the best introduction is a book called In Broad Daylight. From there, you just get farther and farther down tangential paths, trying to figure out what happened. Less info on the 2 later cases, but still an internet black hole you can fall into for days. Story 8, Shipwrecks. Been absolutely obsessed with them the past few days. There's so much to discover and learn about, and so much corruption, as well as just interesting circumstances that these huge machines go down in. And adding to that, technical diving accidents, especially in shipwrecks. You can dive down to the sunken Andrea Doria, that wrecked because another enormous ship collided sideways into it, ship and collect first-class dinnerware as plunder, but people have died, seemingly becoming lost in the complete darkness of the halls inside, or user error in any capacity, such as not having the correct oxygen tank levels leading to hallucinations and false confidence that makes you drown. Story 9. Art forgery and fakes. I've been watching a BBC series called Fake or Fortune, where people try to get their art validated as being by an old master. They've had Renoir, Monet, etc. The program goes into how both modern-day and historic forgers use techniques to make a picture or sculpture look original. It sometimes also shows how corrupt the art validation world can be, with one episode showing overwhelming evidence that a picture was genuine, but the organization responsible for cataloging the original works of the artist refused to acknowledge it. Interestingly, the head of that institute is now under investigation in France for hoarding EUR1 billion worth of missing artworks. Story 10. The times when we have gotten close to extinction. There was a false report from a Russian radar thingy, and they thought that nukes were coming to them from America. If it wasn't for one person, nuclear Armageddon would have happened because of a software glitch. Another good one is how some horrible stuff like cannibalism is legal in certain scenarios. Story 11. I recently watched Chernobyl, so I've been looking into radiation poisoning, what it does to people, and why it happens in the first place. Gets pretty dark pretty fast. Just reading about how nuclear power works in general is very interesting, but quickly starts to go over my head. Story 12. Religious cults. There are so many documentaries out there, literally weeks of entertainment. I spent like a solid month a year or two ago watching documentaries, YouTube videos about the Mormon Church. There are a crap ton of videos and articles about the various Christian funding groups, cults, and once you get deep into the rabbit hole, it's honestly scary, like straight up sinister. This is mine. Not just the cults themselves, but the psychology behind why people get sucked into them, have a hard time escaping and adapting back to reality when they leave. Fascinating and terrifying. Story 13. North Korea. This country lives in its own reality. You can spend hours, days, or even weeks following links to find out the details of their own version of everything we think of as universal. It's like they erased all of human history and made their own culture up whole cloth. They have their own version of communism mixed with religion and idol worship, their own way of dating, science, medicine, and movies. They even have their own version of fabric that evidently all clothing is made of, that is only made and used in North Korea. Story 14. Mantises, how they fight and how evolution bizarrely went off the norm to make these violent and alien-like creatures. And mantises straight up aim for the head and eat the brains out of prey alive. Some even hunt birds and small fish. And then there's the mantis shrimp, not really related other than the name, but they're worth mentioning. That thing is pretty insane. They have club arms that attack as fast as .22 caliber bullets, boiling the water around them, and have eyes that can see colors we can't. Story 15. Read the history of Smedley Butler, a history you've never heard of because people in power did everything they could to scrub him from the history books. He was an American war veteran who was beloved by the people after World War I. This was right after an event called the Bonus War, where veterans from the World War marched in mass to the White House after being promised a bonus for their time abroad but never getting it. This event was so big that the National Army was used to disband it. Smedley Butler was a part of this bonus army, and they would do anything for him. He realized after being such a decorated veteran that all he was doing was earning money for bigwigs instead of helping the American people. During this time, a man tried to get a hold of Smedley Butler. Eventually, they met, and the man said he had powerful rich friends in the United States who wanted to change our governmental system into that of Mussolini's fascist state and wanted Smedley Butler to rule it. They wanted this because FDR took America off the gold standard, which would have cost them a lot of money. Smedley, being a good patriot, blew the whistle on this. No convictions were ever made, and it was called a hoax. However, there were some very big names involved who put a lot of money into making sure nobody knew they had anything to do with it. People like Kellogg's, DuPont, J.P. Morgan, and a man by the name of Prescott Bush. Yes, that Bush. Story 16. What happened to the Norse settlement in Greenland after Homo sapiens left the African continent and migrated east and west? The reunion of peoples who migrated in different directions would have occurred in Greenland around 1000 CE. A Viking and an Inuit stumbling across each other somewhere in that cold, isolated land. I think we're pretty sure they either moved back to Iceland, died off, or maybe joined the Inuit. Sailors from Norway visited Greenland in the 1300s and found the settlement abandoned. We know for a fact that the Vikings and Inuit intermingled. From genetic evidence, we know they intermarried, as many Icelanders have Inuit genetic markers. Both the Inuit and the Icelanders also have oral tales about encounters. According to legend, the two peoples lived in peace until a native woman accused the Vikings of some crime, provoking a war. Story 17. Wolf attacks in Europe from the Middle Ages through the Enlightenment. Doesn't really happen anywhere on Earth anymore, but back then, so many. Plus, the amount of carnage a lone wolf can create in a small village is amazing and horrifying. I don't mean one by one over some extended period, but wolf shows up in the village, kills 8 people, and injures 5 before someone manages to pin it to the ground with a pitchfork. Sheer insanity. Story 18. The lost cosmonaut theory is a theory that multiple people from the Soviet Union were sent to space but never made it back. Some guys claim to have recorded transmissions and heartbeats back from the victim. Just as interesting are the early Soviet and American space programs. There are also tons of weird stuff that happened during the moon missions. All good stuff. Story 19. Missing persons and deaths in America's national parks and forests. The ones that didn't involve foul play are the more interesting ones to me. The debate between when you're lost in the forest to either keep moving or stay in one place to wait for help. People in either scenario have died. Geraldine Largay is a good example of this. A woman hiking the Appalachian Trail in Maine got off the trail and hopelessly lost. She hiked 2 miles off the AT, set up camp, and waited for help. She stayed at her camp for 26 days before she died of starvation and exposure. Even after extensive searches, she wasn't found until 2 years later. BTW. The correct method is to keep moving. Story 20. Left-right brain split surgeries screw me up every time I've read anything about it. In some people with chronic seizures, doctors can perform an operation to stop them by severing the congestion between both lobes of the brain. It doesn't really negatively affect their life that much. Except for one little quirk, the person can only perceive and react to things from their dominant eye, but the other side of their brain is still alive and processing and reacting to things. So if you split their view between each eye, they'll tell you it seems like you just covered up the other eye. If you then show something to that eye, they'll tell you that they can't see anything because from their perspective they can't. But the corresponding hand can still write the word if you ask them to, even though they'll have told you they can't see and sure as hell can't write anything. So, there's functionally another person in there who controls half the body and can perceive and react to things that the talking brain is fully unaware of and unable to react to. Was that person there before their brain got split? If they didn't, where did they come from? Freaks me out. Story 21, alternate history, and the notion that human society didn't just blossom 13K years ago and that there likely were advanced civilizations that were destroyed before then. It's not some zany alien weirdness, but questions about the large amount of cultural similarities between distant ancient civilizations and how they all sprung up around the same time around the Earth. Graham Hancock is a well-known voice about some aspects of this theory. Story 22 number stations have always been a favorite of mine. It all started with the buzzer, but then you hear about stuff like the Lancashire Poacher and Yosemite Sam. The last one is super weird because it didn't seem to serve any purpose. It would broadcast a short data burst lasting 0.8 seconds, followed by a sound clip of Yosemite Sam. It was tracked to somewhere in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where 2 amateur ham radio operators found the place they thought it was coming from, but were chased away by security guards. Shortly after this, the broadcast stopped. Story 23. I've been in Nutty Putty cave before the guy died. I'm not a small guy, and we literally had to scoop gravel out of the way on the first tight spot after the entrance. However, when it came to going through the passage that the gentleman got stuck and died in, I knew my limits and I didn't go through. Scary to think it could have been anyone I was with if they made the wrong move. Several people I was with did the birth canal, but fortunately, no one had any issues. Story 24. All the many ways the CIA has interfered with foreign governments, specifically in South America, and especially if those governments were vaguely socialist. I think one of the most disturbing is the story of Chile and Salvador Allende, as well as the man who came after him, Pinochet. And if you want to go darker, look into all the things the CIA, FBI, etc. have done to American citizens on American soil. Story 25, I wouldn't say it's dark, but it's deep. Agriculture regeneration, land recovery, drought practices, permaculture, renewable energy systems, aquaponics, and soil building. It's all sort of related. Recently, I came across some interesting information. If you drain a marsh or wetlands, everything dries up for miles. Creeks, rivers, soil, grass, trees, everything dries up. In turn, other systems are affected. One wetland drained could help destroy a system 100 miles away. It's all pretty messed up, and recovery is a hard line in the dirt. Wherever the attempts to stop recovery end, the line in the dirt will show where efforts stopped. leaving one area lush and green, while the dirt line shows where efforts end, easy to destroy, hard to fix. Story 26. Data collection is done by big tech companies like Facebook and Google. The amount of data they collect and the accuracy of the personality profiles generated by their systems are absolutely mind-blowing. They're so accurate that they are often able to predict the future. As in, you would probably be in need of buying this. No, I'm not. But somehow next week you are. In short, they are not spying on people's conversations through the phone's microphone, but their profile of you is so accurate that they can predict what you might want to see, buy, etc. several days beforehand. The Social Dilemma and I, Human are two documentaries that are good starting points. Story 27. The hum is a mysterious auditory phenomenon that, by some estimates, 2% of the population can hear. It's not clear when the hum first began or when people started noticing it, but it started drawing media attention in the 1970s in Bristol, England. After receiving several isolated reports, the British tabloid The Sunday Mirror asked in 1977, "Have you heard the hum?" Hundreds of letters came flooding in. For the most part, the reports were consistent. A low, distant rumbling, like an idling diesel engine, mostly audible at night, mostly noticeable indoors. No obvious source. Story 28. Current fertility of humans. It could quickly become a huge issue. Basically, we are about as bad as pandas at successfully bringing a conception to birth. Far better after that, though, in terms of infant survival. The thing currently sustaining us is that we have far longer periods of fertility and many more chances to conceive. Our rate of loss for pregnancies is astoundingly high when compared to other mammals, even our close relatives. It makes the efforts to criminalize abortion absurd. If those people really cared about saving babies, they would be focusing on women's health instead. Story 29. References to psychedelic mushrooms in early Christian art and literature. That whole body and blood of Christ thing turns out to be coded references to the life cycle and preparation of Amanita muscaria and psilocybin. If this is true, much of Christian and Catholic history is the history of fighting over and keeping this secret. There are lots of nested conspiracies here, for example, that Wasson intentionally omitted references to Catholicism when proposing A. muscaria is soma due to his ties as a banker to Catholic banking, or that Gnosticism makes more sense. What makes the rabbit hole go deeper is you can recreate and take these sacraments yourself. It's one thing to hear this stuff and study it. It's an entirely different thing to fly into the face of God and have God confirm the theory is true. Story 30. Mount Everest. The costs. What Sherpas actually do, how much Sherpas are paid, the deceased people who are used as markers, i.e. green boots, the rubbish and waste, and how they degrade the impact on the Nepalese economy, the complicated relationship between the Chinese side of Everest and the Nepal side, David Sharp and Summit Fever. Interesting fact. Sir Edmund Hillary is considered a New Zealand hero for being the first to climb Everest. He's even printed on their money, but he was there with the English, on a paid English expedition. He also stated he wouldn't be able to go there with Tenzing Norgay, his Sherpa, and that he didn't understand the cultural significance of the summit to the Nepalese people. Interesting fact, climbing Everest from the China side would be infinitely easier and safer for mountaineers. However, they only release an average of 12 passes a year to climbers. This is because Everest also holds cultural significance to China, but they have an independent economy separate from Everest, so they can afford to keep it essentially closed off to the public. Story 31. Research the rise of seed vegetable oils. Oils have found their way into almost everything we eat. They account for a massive amount of calories in the Western diet and are almost completely devoid of nutrition, basically empty calories. I believe they are a large part of the reason why most Americans are obese and nutrient deficient, yet they are largely promoted as part of a heart-healthy diet. They aren't bad for you, they are just empty calories, and you don't even know you're eating them most of the time. Story 32. British royal history is very well documented on Wikipedia. The more interesting part is that you could also come across interesting noble houses too and keep going deeper and deeper. You open a noble's wiki page and end up reading about wars and revolutions you never thought were related. Since my interest has been in royal mistresses, affairs, and courtesans, you are just surprised at how they were accomplishing that much debauchery. Like King Louis XV had relationships with 4 out of 5 de Nestle sisters. Story 33. Camels. There are 2 types, dromedary and Bactrian. A herd of camels doubles every 8 years. over 15 million dromedaries live in the Horn of Africa. South Africa has its fair share of camels as well. Australia has a feral camel infestation. Camels are very rude. They will spit on you. They will also stick their long necks inside your car window. Their urine comes out thick, mucus-like. Camels are considered a nuisance, yet they will transport a human across a large desert unharmed. Camel milk is becoming a small business option. In Australia, one man made $250,000 in 1 year. There is a lot to research about camels. Story 34, the missing cosmonauts. The Soviets will go so far as to edit photos to erase astronauts who died in action from history. And a lot of them died in action. The ill-fated voyages of the USS Terror and Erebus. It was an Arctic expedition. They had the most advanced technology of the time. The buzz around it was the equivalent of the first moon launch, and they were never heard from again. Early American colonization, a whole lot of wild shit happened. It's so in-depth that they rarely have time to cover it in normal history classes, but it's definitely something to look into. Story 35, Lost Cosmonauts. The conspiracy theory that the USSR rushed the space program so hard that they had lots of accidents and then covered them up by never admitting to the failed launches and airbrushing the deceased out of existence. One particularly troubling account tells of the first woman in space who was overheard by ham radio operators as she burned up on re-entry, cursing the politicians and engineers who sent her to her death in a poorly built spacecraft. Story 36. Some of the methods used by the US to fight in Vietnam make for incredibly interesting reads. Agent Orange is a good read, but I recommend looking at Death Cards and Operation Wandering Soul. A quick rundown for both. Death Cards. The North Vietnamese were said to be suspicious of the Ace of Spades as it was thought to bring bad luck and death. US soldiers would place the Ace of Spades in the mouths and on the bodies of dead NVA and Viet Cong. This did nothing to affect the North Vietnamese, but it boosted US morale. Wandering Soul. The US mounted speakers on swift boats and helicopters playing Buddhist funeral music and recorded voices of supposed dead NVA and VC soldiers. The voices would call the NVA and VC and tell them to return home. I believe that the North Vietnamese belief was that if a soldier wasn't buried properly, their soul would wander the earth in anguish.